sure that my stream is running. Yep, cool. Oh, make sure to go through this way. Alright. Any questions from you guys before we get started? Cool. As a reminder, the test will be when we finish this chapter, based on how much I was able to go through in my Tuesday, Thursday class yesterday. We definitely won't be finishing in a day because we just really barely got started on Monday. So we'll probably get maybe about a halfway to 2/3 of the way through today. We'll probably finish up on Monday, and then have our review next Wednesday, so the test will be the following week. So we'll do the review next week and then have the test after that. So after today, I'll put the... Okay, actually let me make sure that my sound's going through. I'm always paranoid about that because of the many times it's not worked. So I'll put the study guide up on Blackboard after we finish class today, and we'll go from there. So, yeah, let's see how far we can get today. So we finished here. Railroads. We talked about air brakes, the automatic coupling devices, which, as I said, was something I learned about as a small child, with my little train sets. Even the automatic lubricating devices that kept the trains running. And then we, of course, talked about Edison, with all of his bringing people together and getting them to invent things, and him taking credit for it because that's what Edison did. Got a lot of that. Right, I think that was about it for that. And then, of course, GE, which is what Edison Electric Company eventually became. All right. So into the New South, the gradual movement of the Industrial Revolution into the South. We have the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, Henry Grady, said that the defeat of the Confederacy was due to the North's superior manufacturing output and railroad supply lines, which isn't untrue. Had we had time to go into the Civil War last semester, I think this was a picture that I had in that that PowerPointer. This might have been from my American Technology course, but I know somewhere I had a picture of Union soldiers on the back of a train, and on a flat car they had an artillery piece. Not World War I artillery, but it was bigger than a regular cannon. They very much had a technological advantage because the South was so heavily agrarian. They didn't focus on industrial capacity. Richard Edmonds, editor of the Manufacturer Records, talked of the virtues of the real South, the music of progress, whir of the spindle, buzz of the saw, roar of the furnace, throb of the locomotive. Basically, he said that the, quote, real South was just as industrious as the North, which wasn't true. But he felt like we could make it true. We could be as industrious as the North. But also that for the South to survive, this regional separation needed to give way to a combined national economy. That we needed to not focus on just having our own, independent regional things. We need to come together and work as a nation so that the South doesn't just continue to be like 100 years behind the North. So once again, railroads were a big part of this. Railroads, again, moving goods back and forth, raw resources back and forth, to substantial speed, connected the North and South. And also, what's most important for this, had a major growth on the impact of the a major impact on the growth of the textile industry. As we'd seen last semester, for the most part, the textile industry was the United States grew the cotton and then sent it to Britain to make into cloth. Well, now, since we're not having to rely on Britain for that, for a while we were sending the cotton up to the north to make into cloth. But now there's a lot of textile mills being grown in the south. Being built. Plentiful cotton, cheap labor, and now with this improved transportation, which again is to say railroads, these textile mills are cropping up all over the place, particularly in the Carolinas and Georgia. Owners would hire girls and women because they could be paid less, although oftentimes they'd hire entire families because fathers wouldn't let their daughters go out and work on their own. So these new factories will be a safety net for these farmers who lost out after the Civil War. And for the black families, they had to work the most menial jobs, which is to say typically they were back out on the fields again. They were making a little bit of money, but not much. African Americans also were a major force in railroad construction, but they didn't make any money doing this. This was part of the convict lease system, once again, because thanks to the 13th Amendment, where slavery is no longer a thing except for as punishment for incarceration, and thanks to the black codes where you go to jail for being black, we now had a bunch of black people in jail, and now we can make them go to work for nothing. So there was lots of money being brought into the state, lots of cheap labor for the companies because, the jail is getting paid for this labor, but obviously the people aren't. So the African American workers were left impoverished and enslaved in all but name. So here we have Henry Grady. Here we go. Henry Grady's New South, Atlanta, a brave and beautiful city by Harold E. Davis. This must have been a different Atlanta than the one I've been to. That's not very nice, but I don't know. I'm not big on really congested cities, and Atlanta's a congested ass city. Here's the wealth disparity in, what year is this? Does it say the 19th century? Yeah, so you can see the differences in the wealth from the north and obviously California. And then down here in the south, there's a couple of places where there's some money. I mean, obviously you can see like where the cities are. You've got Charleston here, Columbia. I was like, where is that? That's Columbia. That's what is that down near the border? I don't know. That's not Charleston. That's Savannah. Anyway. And then again, the railroads, and mostly here in the Northeast, and then also a lot here in the Midwest for moving crops, and then, as we mentioned in the last chapter, cattle to the east. A little bit down here in the Southeast. Not a lot in the Southwest. A couple little weird, just like disconnected rail lines here and there. In the south. Midwest. Here's some happy workers in the textile mills. Once again, these spinning belts, you don't want to be anywhere near them. And just as a reminder, these places were huge. I mean, when it goes so far back, you can barely even see the far wall. These things were real big. And then, of course, working outside these textile mills, picking the cotton, making even less money than the people working in the mills, were the African American families getting paid peanuts by comparison, despite the fact that the people working in the textile mills weren't making a whole lot of money either. And then, of course, making even less money, which is to say none, the convict labor. Because they would just go to jail for being black. And now they're doing work because that's what the law says. And this book that I need to get my hands on because it looks like a really interesting read. One Dies, Get Another, Convict Leasing System in the American South, 1866 to 1920, I think that's 5. And the quote down here, before the war, we owned thee, in a very southern word for African Americans. Southern businessmen reflected nostalgically, if a man had a good one, he could afford to keep him, but these convicts, we don't own them. One dies, get another. So, back in the days of slavery, they owned the people, and you didn't want to work them to death because it was an investment. But now that slavery is over, and you can just use the law to basically re-enslave them, you don't own them anymore. You can just work them to death and just get another one. And it's not wasting your money. So, a little bit more on the New South. It was more than just textiles here in the South. 1880s, James B. Duke establishes cigarette manufacturing empire in Durham, North Carolina. If you're wondering why everything in North Carolina, and also now down here in South Carolina, is named after some dude named Duke, this is why. He made all of the money. Technically, Duke University isn't named after him. He did give the university a massive grant, and they were going to name the university after him. And he said, oh, no, I don't want that. Name it after my father instead. So it's technically not James B. Duke University. It's whatever his father's name was, but it's just Duke University. So, yeah, it's this dude. So the tobacco fields will be worked by black laborers, of course, being paid hardly anything. And then the tobacco will be sent into the cigarette factories, which will be worked by white workers, typically young women, because again, they could be paid less. And they would roll the cigarettes by machine. And besides just tobacco, we've got a lot of pine trees here. If you haven't noticed, if you haven't been to South Carolina very long, we get a lot of pine trees, which I'm happy to say we still do. We haven't deforested the hell out of our state yet. So there was a burgeoning lumber industry in the Carolinas, Florida, and Alabama, which provided jobs for both blacks and whites. Coal and iron was found in Alabama, which fueled a steel industry in Birmingham, which was like the reason Birmingham even really exists. produced over 1 million tons of steel by the turn of the 20th century. So that was pretty cool. I mean, having like a place to just make steel right here in the heart of the South was a pretty big deal. So despite all this industry, the New South was not that different from the Old South. Northern investors needed to come in and, well, put money into all of this, and they were attracted by the cheap labor because people were, well, not being paid hardly anything. Low wages meant that the people doing the work often couldn't afford the products they were making, which again is something that sounds pretty familiar. And even then, most of the South remained largely agrarian, and even trying to diversify crops was met with resistance because people were used to doing things the old way, which often meant that the soil would become exhausted and crop yields would fall, and then people would lose all their money and their land would be taken by the bank. Which was fine with the Southern elite because they liked keeping things how they were, and the people that weren't them poor and destitute and reliant on them. So here is James B. Duke. Again, if this was Duke University, we'd all know what this guy looked like. His pictures would be everywhere. Here is inside the cigarette factories. Again, mostly young women working there. And I believe this is also like an actual photograph from outside one of the factories. These are like little girls working in the cigarette factories. But again, like, it's the 1800s. There's no such thing as child labor laws. There's also no such thing as like an age on smoking. Which, I mean, tobacco was not even considered a thing back then. Everyone was on opium. Tobacco was like candy. I always say, if you've ever got a question about like why Edgar Allan Poe was the way he was, it was the opium. There's folks picking tobacco. Now this is a little bit more recent. You can see up here, this dude's on like, it's not even like a tractor. It's a sort of a tractor. Yeah, it's a tractor. I can see the tires. This is a bit more recent than the 1800s, but I mean, we all know what tobacco fields look like. Again, we're in South Carolina. We've seen fields of tobacco. You go down any back road here in South Carolina, you've seen a field of tobacco. There's our lumber, and also I was putting this together when I was upstate. And once you get past a certain point, basically once you get past like Columbia, there's not as many, which I mean you can see here, there's not as many pine trees. You get to a point where it's like you get towards the mountains, and I was living like right up in this area. You start not seeing pine trees, and I was starting to miss the pine trees, the ugly ass pine trees, and you know the awful red mud everywhere. So I grabbed this picture just to show my students upstate. It's like, this is where I basically lived, was, you know, the pine trees and the red mud. Anyway, this is part of an iron mine and a coal mine. If anybody's claustrophobic, I apologize, but that's coal mining. That's why so many people die mining coal. I mean, you can see the crack in the ceiling already. And then the chute to go down. This is a surface mining operation. I think this is coal as well. This was most common in places like Britain, where they had like surface level coal. I don't know if this is actually in America. All right. So, besides all of this, all of these various industries, um, there was also various types of business practices that typified this era. Um, because, well, we talk about the 19th century, especially the late 19th century, um, we have to talk about these like major business tycoons, Carnegie and Rockefeller and Jay Gould, and these um, captains of industry or business tycoons, or as some people would call them, robber barons. So yeah, not just the industry themselves, but how the industries were run. So there was lots of schemes to buy out or destroy competition. Um, with these big factories, this machinery meant there was a steep overhead cost, so people would look for ways to cut costs elsewhere. One such way was to increase output, also known as the economy of scale. Basically, by putting out lots of product and saving on production by either paying your workers much less, because that was a common thing, or reducing manufacturing costs, or basically making it so that it costs less to make lots of the product, they can make profit by essentially mass producing whatever it is they're making. Because prior to this, everything that was made was like a long process. And now we're getting to the point of essentially mass production. Another tactic was vertical integration, where you'd have one of these business tycoons creating an entire system as opposed to just the final product. We'll get more into the nitty-gritty of this later, but one example is Andrew Carnegie. He's the steel guy. In 1881, he combined his operations with Henry Clay Frick, who had access to coal. You need lots of coal in order to run the furnaces to turn iron into steel. So rather than having to buy coal from a third party who could at any point raise the price of coal and make you pay more, he pulled someone in who had access to coal and now had a guaranteed supply. A guaranteed cheap supply of coal, so that price would never go up for him. There's other parts of vertical integration where they would like buy out train lines so that they could transport the raw resources into the plant and then the finished product to wherever they were sending it without worrying about the railroad rates. Eventually, they weren't able to do that and had to work with the railroads. And at a later point, like especially Rockefeller, who is the oil guy, he came to such blows with the railroad that eventually he completely went around the railroad and built like a pipeline from his refinery to wherever it was he was sending his oil, because they wouldn't give him like the discounted rate he wanted. So he just like, screw it, we'll just build a whole ass pipeline, like the biggest pipeline in the world at the time, because they wouldn't bend over backwards for him. Speaking of Rockefeller, horizontal integration, basically where you buy up firms that are your competition, and thus eliminating competition. So in the mid-1870s, Rockefeller had combined his Standard Oil Company with other companies that also produce oil, to the point that he controlled 4/5 of the market. When you control that much of the market, you can do whatever you want. So he could then like drop prices on oil and essentially take a loss, because when you have 4/5 of the market, you have plenty of money. Um, but then drop prices so much that smaller companies will essentially go bankrupt, and then you control the whole market, and then you can raise prices back up and continue to make a profit. I mean, if one company controlled 4/5 of, 4 out of 5 gas stations in the county, and suddenly 4 out of 5 gas stations drop their prices by like $1 a gallon, everyone will go to those gas stations. And the ones that couldn't afford to drop their prices will go out of business. And then the ones that were still in business would just bring their prices back up to whatever they wanted. We'll get more into this in a minute, because this does have some other aspects to it. Because if you're familiar with anything about business, this looks a lot like Monopoly, and it is. And we'll get to how that works. So here is Carnegie. He was Scottish. If you're familiar at all with the first Jurassic Park movie, he does look a lot like John Hammond. If you're familiar at all with the novel version of Jurassic Park, the original depiction of Jurassic Park, you know that John Hammond was a piece of crap, and he died horribly, as he deserved to, in the book. And that was Carnegie. He was a monster. All of these guys were monsters. They were all soulless assholes. So there is Carnegie's steel foundry. Also, apparently, people just didn't breathe in the 1800s. There just wasn't any kind of... we'll get to the EPA in a couple of chapters. Here's Henry Clay Frick. They didn't get along. This is one of the best book titles I've ever seen. Yeah, Meet You in Hell. Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, and the Bitter Partnership That Transformed America. When we get to the labor unions and how our boy Frick here handles it, I'm going to show you guys a little clip from The Men Who Built America, which, by the way, isn't completely accurate, because the History Channel is not good at having really accurate quote documentaries, but it's funny, and that's good enough for me. Yeah, there's some interesting stuff that happened back then. I should also say that the guy they got to play Carnegie and the guy they got to play Frick looked pretty close to the pictures we just saw. The guy that got to play Rockefeller did not look like this soulless husk. I mean, he still looked like a villain in your typical movie, but he didn't look like this dead body here. Anyway, this is what 19th century oil refinery looked like. A lot of these big like round towers here, which actually the top wasn't I shouldn't say wasn't solid, but it floated on top of the oil. By the way, that was a thing. Like it would sink down when the oil was drained. Once again, people just didn't worry about like having healthy lungs back then. Speaking of oil, lobbying isn't a new thing. There was a lot of concern about Standard Oil getting its, let's say, tentacles into politics. And boy howdy, it did. This is actually something we'll talk about think at the end of the this very chapter. Yeah. I mean, there's a section that actually is called "Why Great Men Did Not Become President." Um, like all the people with drive became these tycoons of industry, and the presidents were just like dudes. We didn't really see like men of action become president until really Teddy Roosevelt, which was like late 1800s, early 1900s. So some more stuff on consolidation. Um, Telegraph industry also used horizontal integration. Um, Western Union got most of the Federal Telegraph contracts during the Civil War. The way telegraph lines worked is they basically set up lines anywhere railroads went, and you had telegraph offices housed in railroad depots. So if you could go somewhere in a train, you could send a message back via a telegraph. If there was a depot beside the train track, you could go in there and send out a telegraph. It was a really good system. Um, I mean, that Manifest Destiny image I showed you guys last semester of like, the spirit of Manifest Destiny moving west and like chasing the natives out, and you've got the train moving westward, and then like the telegraph lines moving alongside it. Like that was almost literally how it went. It was like railroad track, telegraph lines right behind them. Let's see. Stock rose from 3 million to 41 million when Cornelius Vanderbilt bought the company. Vanderbilt did a lot with telegraph lines and railroads. That's why he had so much freaking money. He's the guy that, or his family is the one that built more up in right outside of Asheville, North Carolina, which we will also talk about a little bit later. Let's see. Wall Street tycoon Jay Gould wanted a piece of the action. Wasn't able to do that until 1881 after buying up other companies, merging Western Union with American Union Telegraph Company. Made $30 million profit, and again, this is $30 million in 1881 money, which is like several billion in today's money. The next day, New York Tribune reported, the country finds itself this morning at the feet of a telegraphic monopoly. The people weren't unaware of what was going on with these companies. They understood that the companies had all the power, that these big corporations were gaining a lot more and more power and basically running the country. Again, boy, that's sure is nice that that's not a thing anymore. Speaking of consolidation, we had some major bankers, in particular J.P. Morgan. Began his career in the 1850s, investment banker, yada, yada, yada. Channel funds for Great Britain, like railroads, as we mentioned. Refinanced a number of ailing railroads, put his men on the board of directors, which was how he made his money. When he would help with a company, he would put people from his team on their board of directors so that he could help. So he could help run the companies, but also so that he could help with, or so that he could get a piece of whatever profit they made. So whatever work he did would constantly pay dividends. 1901, he helped Carnegie merge several competing companies, creating United States Steel, which became the world's largest corporation, worth $1.4 billion, which was, again, in 1901 money. By 1910, his investments held 340 directorships in 112 corporations, worth $22 billion, which in 2012, which is when the book was written, um, was worth $608 billion. And again, that is now like, what, 12, 13 years ago, so it's worth even more now. Yeah. um, JP Morgan was worth a lot of money. Uh, again, I mean, just at a glance, it's like, okay, here's another railroad map. But no, it's the telegraph map going along the railroads. Because again, it's, east to west, more in the east, and then going west to California. We got one going south down here to Texas, and I guess also to like Mexico. Um, Not a lot down here. We don't get much. Um, but yeah, it's for the most part. Um, I mentioned this to my class yesterday. We don't think much of telegraphs today because, I mean, it's like it's a line and it just makes, it's Morse code, which seems really archaic. But to be able to communicate from one side of this really large country to the other almost instantaneously is amazing, considering this is the 1800s when the Pony Express still existed, when you could get a message from here to here almost instantaneously. But if you wanted to get a message from here to like here, it would take weeks by a dude riding a horse through really rough terrain with like a piece of paper and a sack. So yeah, it's really cool, like how the gulf of technology, just depending on where you were. Here's Vanderbilt. You have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow. I will ruin you. Yeah, he's not going to bother suing a person because it takes too long. He'll just use his business acumen to destroy their livelihood. Yeah, these guys were a bunch of real friendly folks. Um, I mentioned Jay Gould here. He's not often talked about. The book just mentions that he was like a Wall Street tycoon. There he is. Yeah, Wall Street tycoon Jay Gould. Um, I've got a quote from him that's a real good indication of who this guy was. I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half. There's Jay Gould. That's all we really need to know from him. Here's JP Morgan. A man generally has two reasons for doing a thing, one that sounds good and a real one. Which, yeah. JP Morgan also says, gold is money, everything else is credit, which is technically true. Because all the paper money we have is just an agreement that there is some shiny rocks in a bank vault somewhere that we're agreeing is worth something. And anytime I go into money, it's like, it's all fake. We're all agreeing that there's some shiny rock somewhere that's worth, the food and shelter we're living in. And that these shiny rocks are worth this paper we're throwing around, so whatever. And don't get me started on, like, that crypto nonsense they're trying to do now. Anyway, getting into even more things happening, corporations. So, prior to these big corporations, the most common form of business was a partnership. Unfortunately, if you entered into a partnership and the business completely failed, you and your however many partners were part of it had to pay whatever losses there were. And if you couldn't afford it, you had to give up whatever assets you had, your home, everything. And if that wasn't enough to cover it, you went to jail. So that meant not many people really wanted to invest in a business. So with the corporation, there was limited liability, which meant that whatever money you put into a corporation was what you risked. If you put $500 into a corporation and the corporation suddenly exploded, well, your $500 is gone, but that's it. They're not going to come for your house unless you put your house's worth into the corporation, in which case, well, sucks for you. Also, corporations provide a perpetual life, which is to say, in a partnership, again, if let's say you and like 4 other people created a partnership and one of you died, the partnership was over. Again, you'll sometimes see this in movies about stuff in, say, the 17 or early 1800s, where there's something shady going on, and they're trying to track something down, so they're plotting to kill each other, and if one of them dies, then the whole thing falls apart. It's a whole scheme of that era. With a corporation, it outlives any one member of the corporation. That's why GE is still around. It was made more or less by Edison. And unless Edison is cryogenically frozen somewhere, which I wouldn't put it past him, he's an evil bastard, GE is still around. So investors would be more likely to invest in a corporation because it's not going to go away just because one dude cacks it. Needless to say, with all these new systems happening, capitalists were more than happy to take advantage of them. Now, monopolies were technically illegal. This was a thing. This idea of a monopoly has existed for a very long time. So Rockefeller created the trust, which was a monopoly, but technically it wasn't. So rather than being a single company, you'd have a bunch of companies that owned the market, and then the head of each company sat on a board of trustees, and then that board was run by Rockefeller. To give you the actual example, if you look back in time at the oil companies that ran America in, I guess the 1870s, 1880s, it wouldn't have been like Shell or Exxon or whatever. It would have been Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of Illinois and Standard Oil of whatever state. It wasn't just Standard Oil that ran everything, but it was Standard Oil of each individual state. Because if you had one company that was over multiple states, that was considered a monopoly. But if one company was over one state, that technically wasn't a monopoly because it wasn't an interstate thing. Even though they were all called Standard Oil, they were all considered separate companies because separate people ran them, even though they all sat on this board of trustees, which was run by Rockefeller. But a board of trustees wasn't technically a company, technically. This, I described this to my class yesterday. This is like the, if you've been on YouTube for any amount of time, this is like the copyright shenanigans that seems to happen on YouTube every couple of years, where the internet is so dysregulated, either unregulated or they try to overregulate it because it's new and the laws haven't caught up with it. That's what's happening here, is all these types of businesses were new and the laws weren't able to catch up with them. Or the laws would help them because these big companies were putting money in the politicians' pockets. Boy, that would be weird. In 1886, corporations were protected as a person by the 14th Amendment. So the federal law that was written to protect African Americans as citizens was now used to protect corporations from prohibitive government regulations, including number of work hours. So, oh yeah, we can't have the government telling a business how many hours it can work its workers. That's a business's right. Who cares about the worker? We got to protect the business. Yeah, this is why the entire next chapter is on like the worker. Now there was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 that basically took a bunch of these legal principles that were already in place and like put them in a single document. But then like almost immediately there was a ruling that a sugar trust was considered a state activity and therefore was legal. So the Sherman Antitrust Act was essentially made, to use the wording of the book, toothless, in that it couldn't do anything. So it's on the books. There's this Antitrust Act on the books, but there's also a legal ruling that makes this basically pointless. Because you can have laws that exist, but if you have legal proceedings that make that law pointless, then it might as well not even be there. Like, well, I don't know, I guess a speed limit would be a good one. If the speed limit says, you can't go over 55, and then you have a legal ruling that says, well, this guy was going 70, but it's cool, then the speed limit isn't 55 anymore. If there was a legal proceeding, because that's how our laws work, if there's a judicial proceeding that says, well, it's fine, then that law it's not a thing anymore. Or if it's just, it doesn't matter. Because we're based on laws of precedent. Here's Standard Oil as an octopus again. This is a common thing back then. Anytime you've got some kind of large nebulous thing that's like reaching into all different aspects of life. Unfortunately, I can't quite tell exactly what's going on with all these. I think here is like a mother and her child. She looks like she's looking out the window here. I'm guessing her husband died in some sort of industrial accident, but obviously there's no kind of workman's comp, so she's getting nothing. She's just a widow now. I'm not certain about what's going on the rest of them, but same sort of idea. Oh, I keep forgetting about this one. So here is the Railway Trust. This is something we'll also get into a little bit later, but basically what the railroads were doing is the big railroads were giving special rates to the big companies. I briefly mentioned that with Rockefeller, and not giving any, or basically price gouging the smaller shipping companies, essentially running the smaller companies out of business in favor of the big companies. Yeah, it says here, notice special rates and privileges to trusts. So essentially the big, massive corporations are getting the good deals, and the little guys are getting run over. And as I said to my students yesterday, I really like trains. I'm sort of a nerd that really loves trains. But I hate centipedes, so this weirds me out. Centipedes creep me out. And, yeah. All right, let's do some more corporation. Oh, right. Yeah, this slide. As I told my students yesterday, this slide is extremely boring, but it's very important. Uh, the most important innovation of this era was managerial specialists. We're talking about middle managers. Literally the most boring thing. White collar workers, cubicle specialists, accountants, traffic managers, marketing executives. Yeah, I know, it's super boring. But it's important because these corporations are getting so big. You can't just have, like, the guys at the top. You can't just have, Rockefeller and Carnegie and all of that, and then the guys running the machines. You have to have people in the middle to make sure it's all running correctly. So you're getting this growing class of white-collar workers, which is important for the growing 19th century, like, growing middle class. Frederick W. Taylor developed principles of scientific management, calculated the least amount of time a specific task could be done, which left little difference in the workers and the machines. Basically, hey, at optimal efficiency, it should only take you 5 minutes to get this task done, assuming the machine doesn't screw up, or you're cold and you're moving a little bit slow, or you're tired because you've been working 16 hours today. Again, this is something that needs to be fixed with the labor unions, which we'll see next chapter. Yeah. Another thing which, at the start, especially for me, seems really freaking boring, but pretty important in the shift in how life is lived. Retail outlets. With the increased industrialization of America, well, really the world, but we're specifically talking about America, people getting more and more stuff, well, the people produce the country producing more and more stuff, now people are able to get their hands on them. With these department stores, you can more easily go and get them. Macy's in New York City, for example, which is now a place for sales clerks to go and work. So again, expanding the middle class. Consumers could find cheaper products in places like Frank W. Woolworth's 5 and cent stores, chain supermarkets like the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, A&P, allowed urban dwellers to purchase canned fruits and vegetables and meat from meat packing plants, which again, major explosion in numbers. Those outside cities, they could get mail order catalogs and rural free delivery, which gave those beyond the urban sprawl access to the industrial market. So even if you didn't live in cities, even if you didn't live in New York, or access to even these smaller stores, you could still order stuff through mail order catalogs. And I'm about to go into more detail with that because that's something I do find fascinating. You could order stuff and have it delivered to you. So here's, a typical city. I automatically want to say San Francisco because you've got the trolleys down here, but that's not necessarily true. A lot of early cities had these little rail trolleys. This doesn't have like a massive, horrible hill, so this might not necessarily be San Francisco. San Francisco is just one big hill. Okay, here is Sears, Roebuck & Co. Incorporated, cheapest supply house on earth. Our trade reaches around the world. Okay, so the stuff you could get from these catalogs was insane. Okay, so you could get canned fruit and vegetables. You could get meat from meat packing plants. You could also get light fixtures, furniture, shotguns, cars just like disassembled and sent to you in a box, and you put the car together. You could get a house, like flat pack, sent to you in like a crate, and you build your own house. This stuff was crazy. It was really cool. All right, let's get a little further on. We might actually be able to catch up to my Tuesday, Thursday class, and I'll be very happy with that. So, the industrialization developed quickly due to the traditional ideals and values that were part of the American psyche. Hard work and diligence resulted in success because people felt like they were duty-bound to work for upward mobility. This was bolstered by churches, schools, intellectuals, popular writers. They believed that success was something that was morally desirable. This goes back to what we talked about last semester with the Puritans and the whole, Protestant work ethic, where success in really anything you do is seen as a sign of your moral superiority, and should you fail, it's your fault. It's due to something inherently morally wrong with you. If you succeeded, it was because you were more talented, industrious, and resourceful than others. Businesses consider competition in the market as positive and healthy, despite the fact that those on the top created systems to destroy competition. Don't call me. Free markets relied on the government for assistance and protection, like we mentioned with the 14th Amendment. We'll talk more about that in a minute. That said, this slide is mostly just the overview of this section. Combined with the ever-increasing wealth disparity, there were quite a few that criticized the business tycoons of the day. So let's get into that. Obviously, those at the top justified their success to the rest of the world. They used Adam Smith's idea of laissez-faire, which is French for let things alone. It was made popular during the Revolution in The Wealth of Nations, which, again, those of you that were here last semester, we talked about that. It described the invisible hand of the market, which is essentially supply and demand. Greatest economic prosperity as long as the economy was not restrained by outside intervention. A real simple supply and demand economics. As I said, success was seen as something moral. School children were raised to believe this. Russell Conwell, pastor of the Grace Baptist Church in Philadelphia, had a sermon entitled Acres of Diamonds. He said, I say you ought to get rich. It is your duty to get rich. And he got rich by making money in fees by giving said sermon. What? Anyway. And as I said, the opposite was true. Economic failure was seen as a lack of merit. British philosopher Herbert Spencer gave the theory of social evolution in his book Social Status. Humankind was constantly moving towards perfection. Those at the top were morally superior to the less fortunate. Darwin's On the Origin of Species added some scientific legitimacy. And the two ideas were later used together with social Darwinism, which isn't a thing, but, whatever. Obviously, most people would never achieve the wealth that Carnegie had attained. They were led on by the hope that it was possible. I do recall, in the 90s, everyone can be a millionaire. And then you live through, 6 economic crashes, and it's like, yeah, that's great. You go to college and get a master's degree and make half of what your parents made not going to college at all. So here's Adam Smith. Oppression of the poor must establish the monopoly of the rich. Profit or income inequality are always highest in the countries which are going fastest to ruin. In other words, greed causes poverty and economic instability. So, yeah, Mr. Laissez-faire also had something to say about economic inequality. Here's Russell Conwell. Money is power. Every good man and woman ought to strive for power to do with ought to strive for power to do with it. When obtained, I say, get rich, get rich. There's Herbert Spencer. The ultimate result of shielding men from the effects of folly is to fill the world with fools. Thanks, Herbert Spencer. And there's Darwin. It is not the strongest species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. That's why survival of the fittest is often misunderstood. It doesn't mean like the strongest. It means it's the most fit to survive in the climate that they're in. All right. Let's at least finish this doctrine of success. So again, capitalists didn't want the government to interfere with the poor because they didn't want the government interfering with their system. But Carnegie at least felt that those with wealth should aid the poor. In his essay, The Gospel of Wealth, he said a man who died wealthy died disgraced. However, he did specifically make a point between charity, which was handouts to individuals, and which he was against, and philanthropy, building institutions to raise educational and cultural standards, which he supported. So lots of universities and libraries were founded and named after these industrial giants. So you have all sorts of libraries, universities named after these rich guys. Again, Duke University being one such. These were seen as acceptable. They gave the poor a tool to improve their lot in life. I'm going to skip ahead a few decades. When we get to the Great Depression, and once FDR gets involved, he puts someone in charge who starts just really burning through money. And someone asks him if he's, how does he put it? If this is going to work in the long run. And he says, I'm not worried about the long run. People don't eat in the long run. They need to eat right now. And that's how I look at this. He's like, oh, we don't want to do charity because that's just giving them money. We want to make it so that they can, improve themselves. Like, well, improving themselves won't put food in their belly. If they're starving right now, going to the library ain't going to help. So that's just my thought on that. Capitalists support the idea of laissez-faire. Their actions very much undermined and destroyed competition. Rockefeller himself said, the day of individual competition in large affairs is past and gone. And once again, capitalists as a rule were against government involvement, but that only applied when it was restricting their work. They opposed measures that would restrict business, but welcomed actions that aided them, supported tariffs that protected against foreign goods, requested government troops to break strikes, and boy, did they. Looked for grants and army assistance when building railroads, clearing bison and Native Americans. Sought laws for property rights to protect businesses from attacks by workers, and so on. Here's Andrew Carnegie. You cannot push anyone up the ladder unless he is willing to climb, says Andrew Carnegie, the guy at the top of the ladder. As much as I'd like to push through one more slide, we'll go ahead and finish now, and we will continue on Monday. We should be able to finish up on Monday, and then we'll do the study guide on Wednesday. So I'll see you guys next week. Have a good weekend. Oh.